Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Braden Knutson. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled, "What Will Happen to Your Genealogy When You Die?" James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy's Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
Hello. Thanks for coming and listening to another Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar. Today we're going to talk about what will happen to your genealogy when you die. And I don't assume that this is the most pleasant subject in the world for people to think about, but it's something that we really need to confront, especially those of us who are a little older than those that are younger. First question and first issue here is that we will all die, obviously. The only question is when. Now I'm sounding like an insurance salesman, but this really is an issue with genealogists. And the real issue is what will happen to all your research when you die. If it looks like this, you may have a real problem. But a lot of times it doesn't look like this. Now, recently, not too recently, but just some time ago, I was asked to come in and look at some of the genealogy from one of the more persistent genealogists, let's say. And in this case, they asked me to come over and evaluate what they had. Because these people who were the descendants, the heirs of this massive amount of genealogy that had been accumulated, had no idea what it was, had no idea of its value, and really were just interested in getting rid of it so they could have the space in their house. And in this case, it was in a room that was about a 10 by 12 room, about the size of a regular bedroom, floor-to-ceiling shelves, file cabinets, and on top of everything were piled. There were probably a couple of 100,000 pages of genealogical records in that one little room. Now, I tried to explain to these people how valuable this material was and that they should do something with it. And unfortunately, as I left, that was the end of the whole story. I have never heard any follow-up or any whatever happened to all that genealogy. But it's not too atypical for it to have ended up in a dumpster someplace. One time I was giving a seminar in Florida, and the sponsoring genealogical society, as we were about to begin, a man walked in with some boxes, carrying some boxes in. And he walked up to the president of the society and he said, well, started telling about one of the members who had just recently passed away. And he said that, well, he was living across the courtyard in an apartment complex from that person. And he decided he would go over and see what was going on because he saw some activity. And as he walked up, he saw the people unloading the apartment and carrying the genealogy boxes out to the trash dumpster. And he was able to kind of intervene there and get those boxes before they ended up in the dumpster. So these are not, this is not something that happens infrequently. I get these stories almost every time that I raise this issue. And so we really need to be concerned about all of the work that we're doing as family historians or as genealogists. and talk about it and find out about what's going to happen and make some very definite arrangements before the day that you become incapacitated or the day that you depart from this life. Um, the problem, of course, is that the ultimate issue is whether it ends up in a dumpster. And so um, we're going to examine this whole issue and talk about some of the alternatives and what kinds of things that we need to think about, what kinds of things that we need to do while we're still possessed of our faculties and able to take charge of our affairs. So we'll get into this by going to the getting some ideas about the genealogical papers and research and things that we accumulate. This also, by the way, applies to family heirlooms, items that may not have cash value but have a lot of sentimental value, uh, quilts and embroidery and a lot of other items that need to be preserved and perhaps passed on to family members. And it's not just any family member, because there are, of course, members of the family who are irresponsible in almost any family and who would not be the people that you would necessarily want to trust with family heirlooms. So these are the kinds of things that need to be thought through and worked through in advance. Uh, the first important thing to understand is that genealogical research is personal property. Now, what that means is that it has ownership. You you do own your personal papers and genealogical research. You do not own your ancestors. You don't own the information that's in those documents. But if you have documents, they're actually your documents. And if you die, they are part, in the United States, automatically all of those materials become part of your estate. They're part of the documents and things become are property of the estate. Now that's kind of from one aspect, and as an attorney having practiced in probate for many, many years, it's sort of good news in a way. But on the other hand, it's not such good news, because the people that end up administering your estate may have absolutely no appreciation for the value of the records and the genealogical research that's been done. So the whole idea here is to get these documents, papers, research items, certificates, letters, things of value to the family history into the hands of people who will, first of all, appreciate them, and secondly, will take appropriate measures to preserve them and perhaps even carry on the work and advance the research and follow up with some of the undone things that may still be in the planning stages of your research. Now, this is a question that comes up in the context of the estate. Uh, Generally speaking, the question is, what are these papers worth? Do they have a value? Now, sometimes there are items of great value. I had a friend relate a story to me very recently where he inherited some documents from a great grandmother, and they were passed to one of her descendants, one of her children, then passed to another aunt or uncle. In other words, I don't remember the details of the story, but it had gone through two or three hands before he was the ultimate recipient of this pile of paper from his great great grandparent. In examining it, he found that there was some things that he was concerned about, maybe having some value. Ultimately, he donated those papers to a major university, and at the time, because of the donation, they had the papers appraised, and they were appraised at $500,000. So sometimes it may be that the items that have been collected over the years have some real monetary value, but the rule is the more general case is that they're to the people who are inheriting these items, they're simply a big pile of paper that they don't want and it takes up room that they don't want to provide, and they are more than willing to throw it in the trash because they don't want to take the time to go through and figure out what it is and why it would have of any value to anyone. So those are the real questions. Now, um, the questions that we have individually as genealogists is, can we place a value on our genealogical research? In other words, we're not talking about that I don't want anybody to copy this, that this is my stuff, and that I'm afraid that I'm going to lose control of it, so therefore I won't let you look at it, and I'm not going to let anybody touch my papers and things like that. That is the exact problem that creates the issue of the documents being destroyed. So, but the real question still is does this stuff have value to you? In other words, do you value the documents and the paper and other things that you have created that are now sitting in boxes or in drawers or file cabinets or on shelves or wherever they are? Uh, and the question there is what kind of value? First of all, we look at what we would call sentimental value. Now, a sentimental value means that my mother had this dish towel, and this is my mother's dish towel, and I'm not going to give it away because it's my mother's, and this is the only thing I ever got from my mother, and so forth and so on. I mean, I hear this constantly. Um, if you've been doing probate for as many years as I have, you have heard every story about every kind of emotional attachment to items that exist in the world. And in just being around genealogists, you hear the same stories constantly. Uh, but sentimental value is real value. I'm not depreciating the fact that we should preserve some of these uh, heirlooms, artifacts that have connection to family history. We do have families that have passed along very valuable items for generations. Recently, there was a major collection of books given to the BYU Special Collections Library here at Brigham Young University that had been passed down for generations. And that kind of thing is where a lot of our historical records get preserved, and a lot of the things that are very important to you and which are very to which you have an emotional attachment may in a few years or a few generations could be extremely valuable historical artifacts. So sentimental value is something, and if something does have a sentimental value, then that is one of the measures of how you want to place a value on your papers and on your artifacts and things that you've gathered over the years as a family historian or genealogist. The second thing is the question to ask is whether or not they have a monetary value. Now, in my experience, and in my last story to the contrary, most of the records that we accumulate have no monetary value at all. They're simply items of personal property which are included in a probate action. So let me explain a little bit about this idea of the monetary value from the standpoint of what happens into an estate, whether or not you have a will. Now let's assume that you do have a will, uh, no matter how complex, but you do have a will, and you have property that needs to go through probate. You could also have the property in a trust, and in that sense, you might never go to a formal court probate. But it's also interesting that a lot of trust-held property ends up in court anyway. Um, but in evaluating an estate, if in our day and age, historically, if we were to go back and look at old probate records back in the 17, 1800s, you would find that they had to account for everything, including each pin and each teaspoon and each cup and each plate that was owned by the deceased. In our day and age, the only thing that the courts are really interested in is property that may raise the valuation of the estate to the point where there are estate tax concerns, or property that would become valuable enough to be transferred, or titled property. So real estate, cars, those sorts of things are things that they are interested in seeing in a probate inventory. A probate inventory today, the most common one that I would see over many years would be something that went like this: a car, a house with a mortgage, and and various items of personal property not to exceed $1,000. And that's the kind of thing I would see over and over again. So monetary value is something that can only be established in the sense that we're talking about from a court or probate standpoint by a third-party appraiser. It doesn't do any good for you to say, oh, these are worthless, if in fact they actually have a big value, because someone is going to come into court and contradict that. But on the other hand, it's not a good idea to tell people that your personal papers are very valuable monetarily, and then after you die, they find out that they're worthless, and so they get upset and throw them away. Here's the real bottom line, I think, on placing any kind of value on genealogical research from a very pragmatic and from my standpoint, legally oriented background. The question is, how much would it cost to duplicate all of the work that is evidenced by this big pile of papers that we're talking about? That is where the bottom line, where it comes to the bottom line. What would it take to redo all of the research that is contained in these papers? So then the question comes down to, does the work and what you have any value at all? Is it sentimental? Is it monetary? Is it a matter of it would take a lot of effort to duplicate it all, or not? So the only way you're going to be able to determine that is to very, very carefully go through and look at the items that you intend to have preserved or that you're concerned about. And the real question when it comes to preserving these records and passing them on to people is, can you quantify your loss? Is there something that you can explain to people that will communicate the amount of time and effort and the value that you would place on these particular documents? Sorry about that. Okay, so just had a little bit of a choke up there. So the question here is, what is the reality? What is the reality of the papers that are sitting in our research files and all the documents that we want to preserve? Excuse me. And the fact of the matter is that a significant amount of genealogical data is lost every year due to the death of the genealogist. It just happens constantly. Genealogists get old, they die, and their papers are lost. Now, the issue of preservation can be addressed formally and informally. First of all, you can do it formally with a will or trust or other formal document. So there's ways to legally provide for the preservation of the documents. Secondly, you can do it informally by transferring the documents, educating and making friends with the people who are interested in preserving the information, and make arrangements for the documents to be preserved. Okay, now this is an interesting thing. Now let me kind of mention one aspect of this. As we were in as I've been involved with family history centers, libraries, and now the Family History Library here at BYU, we find that people walk in occasionally with piles of documents and books and things and say, we don't know what to do with these. We don't want them. Do you want them? And unfortunately, the family history centers do not have the storage capability or the ability to do much of anything with those documents. In some cases, we could do things with the books, but we couldn't do anything with the papers. And so it was just heartbreaking to see people come in with these piles of books and documents that they personally had no interest in and did not care about, and had represented literally sometimes the entire life production of work of some people, and there was just it was simply lost. So when we're talking about making arrangements, that doesn't mean just tell somebody to take it to the nearest family history center and dump it on them, because they're probably not going to be able to keep it or do anything with the documents or things that you try to give. So what you need to do is find appropriate people who appreciate the the importance of the documents and appreciate the time and effort and value that went into creating all of that information and know exactly what to do with it. And that's the trick, and that's what we try to do to find out where this stuff is going to go. So what are the steps we're going to take for preservation? Well, first of all, we need to do an inventory of all of these papers. We really need to know what it is you have. And it's very helpful if you can sit down and create this inventory with a very, I guess I'd say, uh, skeptical eye. In other words, looking at your documents, you have to be able to set aside your own emotional attachment and your own uh, feelings of ownership and possession, and be able to think, now literally, what would happen to these documents if I were to pass away? And you need to list all of the documents, or at least have some way of understanding what it is that's there, and if anything has anything that might have an extraordinary uh, monetary value that needs to be preserved in some way. And the second part of that is describe any of the valuable items specifically, so that they know that. And it might be important at this point to incorporate that list in any estate planning, will, trust, or whatever you have that could be used to describe your property. Okay, the next is determine where the items should go. For example, who should inherit what. And you need to be very specific here. And the good idea here, in the best practice, is to make all the arrangements long before your time to go, or before you become incapacitated, and transfer those documents before you pass on. Now, it may cause you extreme emotional distress to part with those things, but that's not nearly as bad as the idea of losing it all and having it end up in a dumpster. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, probate court will not put any value on the paper. If you have contesting claims to your estate, which, by the way, kept me in business for a lot of years, um, the issue that you think that it's worth X dollars, and your sibling thinks it's worth 5X dollars, and they're willing to go to court and fight over it. When it gets down to basic court procedures and the way that the probate courts will handle these, is that they will put no value on it at all unless they can get a third party, as I mentioned, third party appraiser, who will come in and testify that the documents have value. And the decision by the court could become very arbitrary and may not be in the best interests of the information and the documents, but will be only in the best interests of the parties involved, which neither party may actually care about the documents. So one suggestion, in a way to avoid this issue, is to add the specific instructions in a will or a trust, so that when the time comes that they have a clear understanding of your wishes. Now, whether or not they follow the wishes of the person who drafts a will or trust is absolutely, it's interesting. I mean, I used to have people that would come in to my law office and they would sit down and say, well, that's what it says in the will. And I would say, yeah, and so? And well, that's what has to happen. And I would say, uh, not very often that it does. Uh, what you really have when you get into a probate action in this day and age in the United States is you have whoever, if there are contesting parties. Now we're talking about contested probates here. We're not talking about where they go to court with a will and nobody ever shows up and the will just goes through and that's the end of it, and the executor does exactly what the will says and that's the end of the whole story. In the life that I've led and the time that I've spent in court, uh, people would not agree on the time of the day or the day of the week. They were essentially going to fight until every last penny of the estate was used up, and then they'd keep fighting after that. So the fact that you put something in a will or trust may be helpful, it may be comforting to you, but it may in the ultimate sense not uh, resolve the issue of the preservation of the information and the documents that are there. Okay, so what are we going to do? First of all, if you do manage to put this information into your trust or your will, make sure your heirs know about the provisions. This old story of reading the will after the person dies and the heirs learn for the first time who the heirs are and who's going to get what is certainly not in the best interests of the heirs or the deceased when we're talking about genealogical information. You really, it may be really dramatic to have the reading of the will like they show on TV all the time, and let everybody know who, Uncle whoever left his fortune to. But in reality, in life today, it's a very good idea that everybody knows exactly where the money's going to go or where the property's going to go or who's going to take care of it. And so if there are any problems that they can get worked out before you leave it to your heirs. In the cases that I have seen where the parents, for example, uh, do not communicate to the children at all where or what property is in the estate, what they own or what they have. Um, it seems to be a problem, sort of a general problem uh, with some people, that they are very tight about their money and their finances and their affairs. And that includes any interest they have in the papers and documents that they've created as genealogists. And so nobody has any idea what they own. And when they die, and it is often very surprising to people to find out that they either have too much or too little. Sometimes they think that their parents are very well off and they find out that they've really mortgaged everything and they haven't got anything. And in other cases, they find out that there's all this money that they didn't know about. Or in some cases where we had very complex estates, we spent years tracking down all the property around the country that the person owned. Okay, so you just it's an interesting situation, and it's an interesting part of our culture and our society that this kind of situation exists, and we really have inherited clear back into the 17 and 1600s because back in those days it was very common that a will was made only a few, even sometimes a few hours before the person died. The idea of planning your estate into the future was really quite foreign. And that's something, though, as genealogists, that we should be very, very, very interested and concerned about, that the information that we've developed over our lifetimes as genealogists, that it be preserved in some way. So if you don't let your heirs know about the provisions of your will, and you don't know that they don't know what's in the will, by the time they find the will, everything may have been thrown out. Uh, it was not unusual that we found out in a probate action that within a matter of days, and sometimes within a matter of hours, after a person died, the heirs or the children or relatives or whoever it was that considered themselves to be the heirs of the person came in and basically stripped the house of anything of value. Um, and walked away with it. And it was not unusual that we would be issuing court orders to have them all bring it back. So, uh, unfortunately, things like genealogical records, nobody's going to care enough about. And if they get thrown away, they're not likely to get carried away. They're likely to get thrown away. So even if you have a will and you don't, if your heirs aren't aware of what's going to happen if they do throw it all away, then there's probably no guarantee that the provisions of the will be carried forth. So everything might get thrown out before they even get around to reading the will. Um, here's some positive suggestions. Now I've kind of painted a really dismal picture of what could happen, and the reason I'm painting that dismal picture is because it happens more frequently than many of us would like to know about, and some of us have agonized over it for years. I personally started my whole major involvement in genealogy as a result of discovering through a long involved process some documents, a very, very large quantity of documents and records and research that had been done by my great grandmother that had been lost for about 20 to 30 years before I uh, obtained the records. So I'm very much firsthand aware of the problem and the danger that could occur if the documents were lost. So here's the first suggestion. The first suggestion is to form and incorporate, if necessary, a family organization. What that does is it gives you uh, an opportunity, a place where these documents can be preserved, where people have some formal, rather legally established uh, interest in getting the in keeping the papers and preserving them and passing them on or processing them as the case may be. The first issue, of course, is to make sure it's funded. If you're going to create a family organization with a formal corporate structure as a nonprofit corporation, you've got to pay for that, and it's got to be have some way for people to continue. So in setting up a trust fund that is there to finance the corporation. Now, what you're going to think at this point, a lot of people will start thinking, well, I don't have the means to do that. I don't even know how to do that. I don't even know if I could do that. The answer to that story is still form a larger family organizations, perhaps an informal one, and then find the people in the family organization who have the means and the interest to formally organize and preserve the information on behalf of the family. This is the kind of the ideal. This is what we would like to see happen, is that these documents are taken over and in a formal way and preserved for future generations. Um, then formally donate all of your papers to the organization. Actually go through the formal paperwork. You may have to work with an attorney uh, unless you have one in your family who's willing to assist with all this. But you then can donate all your papers directly. In that case, you can set a monetary value on the papers and claim as a deduction if you've created a nonprofit corporation. Um, if it's a formal tax-free, uh, non-taxable, excuse me, a non-taxable nonprofit. So that uh, would give you your estate some benefit, and then the family will benefit by having the organization own the documents formally. And then, in addition to that, in all of the documents that are created, make some very specific provisions about the preservation of the research. That's why we go back to my suggestion that you create an inventory and specifically identify any of the valuable information that's there. Okay. Or in the alternative, I mean, the extreme of this is you can create a private library, an organization that handles a lot of information. This will, of course, depend on the amount of information that we're talking about here. But I know of one instance where a private library has been created and actually accepts donations of records from families. So it can become a bigger organization. One of the questions that comes up here is why not give this information to some other archive in a local family history organization, let's say a family and genealogy society or a historical society or a museum or archives of some kind. Um, that may be the case if your ancestors and the information that you've accumulated are very, very prominent citizens, historical figures in the community, and that the information you have is unique and preserves information specifically about that family. So if your family was one of the pioneer families in your county or your state, or uh, came across the ocean very early, and you have artifacts that go back for a lot of years, it is true that there may be a library, like a special collections library of a university, that may be interested in the papers. But you need to explore those options before the uh, the person is deceased. Is when you've got a big pile of paper there and the person who has the paper really doesn't know what it is, it's very hard for that person to convince a library that they should take the documents. But if you are the person that has the documents and you know the value of them and you know the historical connections, you may be able to convince the library to take the whole pile, in which case you've solved the problem. You don't have the problem with the probate, you don't have the problem with the family organization, you don't have the problem with any of those other alternatives. So uh, making a very knowledgeable estimate, review of what you have, and then using a practical approach of approaching the people who may be interested in it to find out if they are. Don't be surprised, by the way. I had a rather valuable collection of old photographs that came into my possession. I've talked about that in other webinars that I've given. And I approached a couple of different organizations about taking these photographs that dated clear back into the mid 1800s, and found no interest at all. I had to until I found the library that was interested in collecting the photographs. In other words, they would have taken them had they simply been photographs. They didn't really care who they were. They were just interested in preserving old photographs. So you have to sometimes spend some real effort in talking to people, um, and don't assume that the local historical society will simply take care of it. They may not have the resources to archive a collection of genealogical significance. Okay, so another I think the most practical way to handle this is the issue of what to do with all of the documents is an informal disposition of the property of the genealogical records before you die, before you become incapacitated. And you can do that, first of all, what I would suggest in any event, I mean, whether or not you're going to try to give the original documents and papers to uh, a an institution of some kind, one that you establish or someone that's already existing, I would suggest digitizing everything. We have the capability today through cameras and scanners to digitize practically any kind of object or item, and then those things can be put online. There are places online which will archive the digital copies and which we can be assured that those digital copies will be curated, kept, and preserved over an extensive period of time. Probably right now, from a very practical standpoint, the one place that you can put photos, stories, um, documents, and even audio files is on FamilySearch.org memory section, where they will take those documents and you can simply upload them after they've been digitized. Now, the advantage of this to the genealogist is that these documents are preserved. No matter what happens to the paper after that, at least the work and the evidence, excuse me, the work and the documents themselves, uh, the information that's contained in the documents is not lost. So that's probably one of the more important things that can happen. Secondly, give copies of these, the digital copies, out to appropriate relatives. When I say appropriate relatives, I mean those who would be interested in your genealogical files. And they may not be your immediate family, they may be more distant relatives, but they may be people that are more than interested in receiving the information that you've accumulated. And then in the last end of that, after they've been digitized and after the files have been given to appropriate relatives or the documents if they're interested, then the rest could be donated to a library, historical society, or other repository. Um, uh, for example, how you go to a special collections library at a university and how you present the documents may be um, uh, maybe in your interest to do some work in before you get to the repository. It's one thing to go to a repository and say, are you interested in these papers that I've accumulated over the years? And they say, well, what are they? And you say, well, they're all my genealogical research. And they say, no, we're not interested in that kind of document. And that's the end of the story. It's another thing to go there and say, oh, I have papers of so and so who was the mayor of this town and was involved in the political structure of the community for years, and then this person who was involved in the school district, and this person who was involved in this, and we have all their personal papers and letters and some other documents of historical value. And when you start talking that kind of language, then it gives the interest, it makes the interest level rise considerably on the part of the archivist or librarian who is listening to what you have to say. So it's a matter of how you present the information in a lot of cases as to whether there is any interest. Uh, Also, uh, as I mentioned already, you can put all of that information online on a non-commercial website and thereby save yourself the trouble of having it lost. Um, and I did mention Family Search. Number one, it is affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is not going to go anywhere in particular. It's not going to go away. And they are very much have a vested interest in preserving this kind of information. So It's helpful if that makes it, any difference. Now, in donating your papers, um, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the first question that is going to come up is there something unique about your documents of papers? And this is where you start getting into the reality of having done a lot of genealogical research. Because what I have found is that the documents that I have been reviewing in some cases are nothing but photocopies, uh, thousands of photocopies, and also they're working papers. They're really, in a lot of cases, undecipherable. You cannot figure out exactly what the person was trying to do or accomplish. And in another case, they're huge piles of pedigrees and or family group records. It was sort of the way of doing genealogy back in the uh, number of years ago when I started into looking at genealogy, that people would haul out these binders of family group records, and you'd see 6, 8, 10 inches, 12 inches, 3 or 4, 5 books of family group records. Well, those family group records, can be transcribed and put into a computer if they contain any information that's not already in an online family tree. And that basically says that those documents, except for sentimental value, have no value whatsoever. They just simply have no historical value. No one really wants a pile of pedigree charts and family group records because that is not, it just has no value. Uh, if for example that was unique and they had never, this was like original research on the part of this person and no one else had this information, at least what I have found is that there's a lot of people that think that's the case, and then when they finally do get online and start to get into online, all the online records that are there, they find out that they're so-called unique family group records that they have sitting in this big binder that's a foot thick, that in fact every last one of those has already been put online and verified. What is even more tragic is when they find out that most of what they aren't even related to those people because somebody made a mistake a few years ago and was following the wrong ancestral lines. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, and then the question, of course, the bottom line is the information available somewhere else? Um, when I started doing genealogy about over 30 years ago, it was a very major task to determine what other people had done. I spent a lot of hours at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City going through what work had been contributed by my family over the previous 100 years about my family. It took me years of returning to the library, and I accumulated, literally accumulated about a 3.5 to 4 foot high pile of family group records before I was through with that process. Well, today I could go on to any one of the major programs online and probably find all of the information that took me all those years to review in a matter of a few hours. And so we really need to be very, very um, results oriented, pragmatically oriented about when we talk about the accumulation of these papers. And it's not unusual that I find people come in with a huge stack of, still today, um, very frequently within the last couple of weeks, as a few weeks, as a matter of fact, people have hauled in a stack of family group records and pedigree charts, and they're just overwhelmed to find out that it's already there online and everybody's already done it. In fact, they usually find out that there's more information online than they have in their family group records. So this is the kind of the other side of the coin, is that in fact the work that was done that I've been talking about, this huge pile of paper that was accumulated, may in fact not have any information that has already been well established or contradicted by subsequent research. So that's kind of the important reason of evaluating and taking some action while the person who accumulated the records is still around to explain what's been done and what hasn't been done. And then the ultimate question, and what I ask almost anybody who walks in with a pile of paper today, is do you have all this in a software program? Uh, it may seem that I'm being a little bit over the top from a technology standpoint, but the idea here is that preservation of this information is going to depend on what kinds of efforts have been made to digitize and incorporate this information into the existing body of genealogical data that's being created online. This brings up a secondary question, and that is people who walk in with a box of old 3.5 inch floppy disks and have all their genealogy on these 3.5 inch floppy disks. That can create a secondary problem that has nothing to do with the probate, but is simply a matter of technological obsolescence and the inability of us in some cases to recover that information at all. So those people aren't usually the ones that we're worried about passing on the information to their children. They're just people who haven't worked on it for years and years and don't really know what they have or how important it is. The ultimate solution, what is the ultimate solution? Is there an ultimate solution here? The answer is collaborate. In other words, if you are involved in a family or a community effort and you are aware of the whether or not the information that you're gathering has any value and whether it's unique or not, collaboration will help to keep you from duplicating efforts that others are doing. It will also help you ultimately to preserve the records that you need, that you have, and that you need to have preserved. The second solution is collaborate. And the third solution is collaborate. I can't emphasize this too much. This is really the way, either through a family organization or individually working with friendly genealogists or friends or whoever it is, but getting that information entered into the computer, preserved, and then making efforts to preserve the paper if it's necessary or valuable enough to be preserved can be immensely helped and facilitated by having a circle of collaboration of people who are willing to help and support. And they may not be your immediate family members. They may not even be close family members, but there probably are people out there who are interested enough in the work as the work itself to assist. So thank you for watching. I think that this is a topic that we all need to think about. Even young people need to start thinking about how they're going to preserve their work. I think there's a tendency of those who are technologically savvy to realize the importance of digital preservation. As kind of an end note here, I would suggest from a preservation standpoint, if you need to understand some of the information about the digitizing and preserving artifacts and things, I would recommend that you go to the Library of Congress, the United States Library of Congress website. It is loc.gov. And there on the startup page, if you go down in the lower right-hand column on the startup page, you'll see a section on preservation, and you'll find that there's an extremely extensive discussion of every kind of artifact and every kind of preservation that's needed, and references to all of the resources for preservation. Okay, well, thank you again for watching. This has been a Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar, and we appreciate you coming. You can find these webinar recordings on the Brigham Young University Family History Library YouTube page. Go to BYU Family History Library on YouTube, and we have over 100 recorded presentations there from around 10 minutes to an hour or so. And we would appreciate you subscribing to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.